What is going on, guys? It is Wrestlegamia here, back with another video. Wrestling, is it something that's primarily for children or adults? It's a debate that waged for years, and there is evidence for both sides of the argument. Vince McMahon clearly positioned himself as more of a children's entertainer during the Hulkamania and PG eras, though with their current audience averaging somewhere in their 40s, it's hard to argue that WWE is pulling in a large youth audience. AEW has tried to position themselves as a more adult product with a TV-14 rating, and some of the most brutal hardcore matches in recent memory that harken back to the Attitude Era. It could be argued that as far back as the 50s, the likes of Gorgeous George were designed more for youngsters, but at the same time, some of the bloody battles over the year from the likes of Abdullah the Butcher or Bruiser Brody have definitely not been child-friendly. Wrestling games have always tried to skew more towards the youth market, but there are some undeniable moments throughout their history that have not been safe for all, and that's exactly why we're here today. So be sure to subscribe and click that notification bell, because today we're going to look at 7 moments in wrestling video games that went too far. Number 1. Gimmick matches. While some gimmicks created during the Attitude Era have stood the test of time, we're looking at UTLC and Hell in a Cell. There are others which are definitely best left in the past and which in hindsight were not suitable for children. The most notable of these would be Bra Panties and Buried Alive matches. The reasons for the former should be obvious. While this kind of titillation was acceptable at the time, it wasn't appropriate for young children even back then, and certainly wouldn't fly today. The latter, Buried Alive matches, are a gimmick that seems hard to believe would work today. While it's clearly campy and over the top, it's difficult to imagine any parents walking in on their children burying their opponents in game being happy. Amusingly, Buried Alive matches would be playable as recent as WWE 2K16, where you could relive Steve Austin's bout with The Undertaker during the Rattlesnake Showcase mode. Number 2. Fire and Blood. No, we don't mean Daenerys Targaryen and her dragons making an appearance in a wrestling game. We're soured enough on that series after its woeful final season. Instead, we're talking about something which has gotten other fighting games such as the Mortal Kombat series into trouble before: the use of blood and even fire. Blood has been nothing unusual in the wrestling world for decades, with some of the sport's most iconic moments being the likes of Steve Austin's face drenched in it, or the crimson faces of Mick Foley in his battles in Japan, but it's less common in today's world, what with increased concerns over the spread of blood-borne diseases and worries about the safety of blading. And while most wrestling games won't feature blood now, or will have at least an option to turn it off, it has been present in the past, with WWE 2K15 of being particularly notable for allowing blood to smear realistically over opponents' bodies. It's just as gruesome to see this in digital form, and another thing parents probably wouldn't have been happy about their children being exposed to. The same also goes for Inferno matches, which have been available in various past WWE games that would allow players to visibly set their opponent on fire. All it would have taken was one kid to copy this for an absolute PR disaster to happen, so it's probably best that these features don't return in the future. Number 3. Wrestlemania, the arcade game's insane endings. Moving on to a more specific example now, Wrestlemania the arcade game, released way back in 1995, had low-key some of the most not safe for work moments in any wrestling game. We're pretty shocked more people don't talk about this one, to be honest, as playing through the game's challenge mode, you would get a different ending depending on which wrestler you chose to fight as. These endings range from the fairly innocuous, such as Lex Luger saving America from the brink of destruction, or Bret Hart becoming a movie star, to the outright crazy. Just listen to some of these. Shawn Michaels' story ended with a block of text describing how he was essentially sexually assaulted by a horde of uncontrollable lust-crazed women. Yokozuna's ended with the collapse of American society as a result of his victory. Doink finished off his challenge mode by trampling much of the audience with wild elephants. Bam Bam Bigelow went on a murder spree as he burned the entire audience alive, and Razor Ramon, well, he took the WWE title back to Cuba, only to be jumped by 4 thugs, fall into a state of depression, and then disappear off the face of the earth. Yeah, it's hard to believe this isn't a joke, but it's there in the game. You honestly couldn't make some of this stuff up. Number 4. Carmageddon. This is another one that's hard to believe actually made it all the way to a final release version of a game without someone stopping and thinking that it was probably a bad idea. In SmackDown 2 Know Your Role, if you fought your way out into the car park in a hardcore match, it was possible to actually get run over by an oncoming vehicle. Yeah, you heard that right. The developers thought it would be a good idea to include vehicular homicide into a wrestling game primarily aimed at children. This was during the time period that Steve Austin was notably written off television in a kayfabe car crash, but that's really no excuse. Imagine the uproar on Twitter if this kind of thing has been included in a game nowadays. Your character does get up quite quickly from any hit and run, but we think that actually makes it worse. If you're going to include something as serious as that, at least don't make it seem like such a flippant injury that could be so easily brushed off. Any parent who saw this must have given their children a crash course in road safety afterwards and probably suggested a different game to play. Perhaps Spyro the Dragon. No vehicular assault in that game. Number 5. Rumble Roses. This one isn't so much a specific moment as an entire game. Rumble Roses is the wrestling game equivalent of the Dead or Alive series, where it seems like more focus was paid on getting the chess physics right than working on actual gameplay. The target market here is clear: teenage boys that would have been watching wrestling during the Attitude Era, and developers Yuke's, who are also responsible for the WWE 2K series, are not being coy about it. The PS2 exclusive featured basic fighting mechanics and used the same engine as SmackDown Here Comes the Pain, but that's not what most people talk about when they talk about this game. Any screenshots will show you a bunch of Japanese manga-style scantily clad women bursting out of what little clothing they had on, and rolling around in the likes of mud matches for the viewing pleasure of the player. It also tried to cater to a variety of fetishes, with wrestlers decked out in dominatrix and nurse and schoolgirl gear, amongst other things. It's so silly and over the top that it's hard to get offended by any of it, but it's still undeniable that this is not one that kids should be playing. Despite all this, there was a sequel, Rumble Roses XX or Rumble Roses 20, released on Xbox 360 2 years later, and there have been persistent rumors of a third game in the franchise being developed to this day, but we think if it ever does see the light of day, it should probably be kept behind a curtain in your local game shop. Number 6. The Brimstone Match. Never one to be outdone when it came to hardcore wrestling, ECW managed to one-up their competitors in the WWE when they released Anarchy rules for PlayStation and Dreamcast in 2000. If the WWE had the Inferno match, then ECW stepped it up to include the Brimstone match. While the rules were pretty similar, it's how the matches ended that separated them. In the Brimstone match, instead of fire, the ring would be surrounded by hot coals, with the objective being to throw your opponent into them to win it. Once this happened, your opponent would be screaming in pain before disappearing into the ether, presumably having been burnt up by the heat. It's genuinely quite distressing to watch and probably upset a number of children who tried it out. We can't imagine this was a match type that was played a lot after its first try. Now, can you imagine if Paul Heyman tried to bust this one out at the ECW arena back in the late 90s? Even their notoriously bloodthirsty fanbase would have probably found this one to be too much. And number 7, the secret darkness of Fire Pro Wrestling. The Fire Pro Wrestling series isn't the first thing that would come to most people's mind when they think of not safe for work moments in games, with its fun gameplay and visually striking sprite characters, but we saved this one for last because it may be the darkest moment in any wrestling game, and certainly one that's not for children. Hell, this is barely even for adults. Super Fire Pro Wrestling Special, released for Super Nintendo in Japan in 1994, had, like most wrestling games, its own story mode. However, the way this one ends may even outdo the insane endings from Wrestlemania the arcade game. Throughout their journey to championship glory, your character will have to navigate a dark tale full of loved ones being murdered in the ring and a girlfriend who leaves you after seeing what you've become by the end of it. It doesn't get any better once you finally win the title either, with a graphic showing your character sitting on a throne feeling dejected after realizing what it's all cost him. It then cuts to the outside of his house 3 days later, where there's a brief pause, followed by the sound of a gunshot as the screen fades to black. Yeah, you heard that one right too. No bonus points for guessing what happened. Man, when the Japanese go hard, they really don't hold back, do they? But there you have it, guys. Moments in wrestling video games that went too far. Be sure to leave your comments down below, subscribe if you haven't already, follow us on Instagram and Twitter, and I'll see you next time with some more wrestling video game content.